One of the important ways yoga was popularized in Britain was through adult education evening courses. And this was a very important part of the culture in the post-war period in Britain, the establishment of the social welfare state, the NHS. And there was a belief that investing in the education and health of the population was a national concern, and there was money for local authorities to offer vocational classes for people to up their trainings, as well as classes to improve their health and happiness. And the organisation of these classes varied from local authority to local authority. There was a precedent for women's forms of exercise and fitness, which were separate from men's. It was often understood that men would play team sports like football, rugby, badminton, kind of competitive games, but there was a longer history of harmonial gymnastics, of Swedish gymnastics, of kind of women's exercise and drills, where you did more calisthenic type exercises all together in a round. And this was an established career path for women, teaching physical fitness, and yoga was able to enter the local education authority evening structure often on the back of this familiar form of exercise. It looked similar, it felt similar, but it had a different name. So it entered the local education, yoga entered the local education structure in a few different places in different ways. In Birmingham, it entered in the Birmingham Athletics Institute in the first instance in a very big way in the 1960s. Hundreds of students were attending yoga classes with a woman called Yogini Sunita at the Birmingham Athletics Institute. And it was at such a volume of interest in this that local newspaper headlines raised the question about prana force on rates on public funds. How should we know who's qualified to teach prana under the local education authority structure? And how that question was answered in Britain, I think, has worldwide impact in the establishment of teacher training syllabuses, in the establishment of certificates for teaching yoga. It was in the context of how do the local authorities know this is a good use of public funds. So the answer to this question varied across the country. There was a lot of regional autonomy. One of the very influential decisions came in 1969 in the Inner London Education Authority, which of course was very influential because of London being a very centre of culture and lots of people coming through London. And the architect of the Inner London Educational Authority's physical education department was a man called Peter Macintosh, and he had this Grecian ideal. He was involved in the re-establishment of the Olympic Games, and he thought that physical culture was an inherent part of being human and an important aspect for people to develop, to really understand themselves. So his idea about physicality was not entirely sexual. Peter Macintosh had an idea about physical culture being part of a holistic human. So it wasn't exactly a secular idea. And when he was trying to promote yoga within this context, it was more than just exercise, more than just games. And he was attracted to the teaching of BKS Iyengar because he saw in it, in his, after the publication of Light on Yoga, a rigor, a high standard of physical discipline, which is what he wanted to promote in his physical education department. And so he introduced a system where only gurus certified by BKS Iyengar would be permitted to teach in Inner London from about 1969 to about 1980. And he specified that only instructions in asana and pranayama were permissible, that you couldn't talk about Indian spirituality or the wider ideas of Indian culture. And in Iyengar's remarks at the time and later, he seems to have agreed with this in that a better life can be taught without using religious language, and he could teach the principles of yoga within this context. So I think he felt like he wasn't compromising, but there's also evidence to suggest he did adjust his language, and that his early demonstrations at the Everyman's Theatre in Hampstead and Highgate in the earlier 1960s included Bhagavad Gita quotes and included putting yoga in a wider spiritual Indian religious context. The Inner London Education Authority was also, when yoga was introduced in the Inner London Education Authority, it was also seen to be, it was hoped to be an exercise that would be appropriate for elderly people and people who couldn't participate in team sports. In actual fact, it tended to be middle-class women who joined the classes. There was also an emphasis on safety, and there are 5 medical conditions outlined that would be inappropriate for the classes. But it was also requested that syllabuses be introduced so that we can ensure that this is a safe form of exercise for the men on the street.